We're going to look at the Neolithic now in the very southern part of Mesopotamia. So we've seen the Neolithic in northern Mesopotamia with the Hasuna culture, then developing into the Halaf culture. We saw the Neolithic in central Mesopotamia with the Samarran culture, showing some of the earliest irrigation in the world and specifically in Iraq. And now we're going to look at the Ubaid period in the very southern part of Mesopotamia. And the Ubaid culture, this is the first settled agricultural cultures in southern Mesopotamia. They probably grew out of Samarran people moving southward. Some of the earliest Ubaid pottery looks like Samarran pottery. The Ubaid time period overlaps with Halaf. And as we're going to see in some sites in northern Mesopotamia, like Tepe Gawra, Halaf culture is replaced, quote unquote, by Ubaid material culture. And that's one of the things you're going to look at for your discussion board this week, is how do we interpret this kind of change in pottery styles and architecture. All right, well, southern Mesopotamia is very different in terms of its environment than central and northern Mesopotamia. It's the Tigris and Euphrates. It's very, very flat. There's a lot of alluvial sediment. That is, the Tigris and Euphrates will flood its banks occasionally and deposit rich soils. But there's virtually no rainfall in southern Mesopotamia, which means that the only way to have agriculture is through irrigation. There's also a lot of marshes in southern Mesopotamia, and the marshes in southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia are world famous. Saddam Hussein unfortunately drained the marshes to punish the Shiite Arabs in the 90s and early 2000s. Most of the marshes have returned. This is a culture and a way of life that goes back thousands of years. The marshes were able to support people because of the fish and the aquatic birds and the plants in that area. People use boats and they travel in between these little islands in the marsh. They build houses out of reeds. You'll see on some Mesopotamian art reed houses that are identical to some of these houses. So in southern Mesopotamia, you have a mix of alluvial sediment, very, very flat ground, and mixed in with marshes. The only way to turn that very flat ground into an agricultural field is through irrigation. And many of the areas of southern Iraq that are now in the desert today were actually near marshes. The Persian Gulf extended further north than it does today. So it was well watered back then. It was better watered than it is today. And we're talking about this area essentially. And this is the what later becomes known as the heartland of civilization. So Ubaid culture shares some similarities in pottery, but not only pottery, also the T-shaped houses that we saw before. We saw the earliest T-shaped houses in the Samarran culture, and we see T-shaped houses in the later Ubaid culture. And the similarity of pottery, lends archaeologists to believe that Ubaid culture was kind of an outgrowth of Samarran culture. Probably Samarran people moving further south and then setting up settlements between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Ubaid culture, material culture, is very distinctive. Very distinct pottery style, figurines, and other artifacts that we're going to see. One of the things that we're going to be talking about this week and next week, especially when we look at the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, is the kinds of resources that are available in southern Mesopotamia. In southern Mesopotamia, there's very good soil, and there are the canals natural canals that actually extend between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and there's also marsh. And it turns out that when you irrigate in southern Mesopotamia, the fields are more productive than the ones in northern Mesopotamia that are fed by rainfall. So if you irrigate, you can create very large abundances of food. However, you can see this is a very flat, everything is covered essentially by silt. There are no mountains in southern Mesopotamia. And so there's very little forest, there's no wood, there's no stone, and there's no metal. So as we're going to see, the environment sets up opportunities and constraints. In some ways, southern Mesopotamia, was resource rich. And in other ways, it was very resource poor. And it was this combination of resources that they had and resources that they didn't have but wanted or needed that kind of sets up an interesting dynamic that may have pushed the development of these societies, right? They wanted stone, they wanted metals, they wanted or needed wood, which meant that they had to trade for those items. And if you're going to trade long distances for those kinds of materials, you have to produce trade goods, and you have to organize trading expeditions. So it's sort of this combination of what they had but what they didn't have that created an interesting dynamic in southern Mesopotamia. Okay, as you'll see, there's evidence that Ubaid pottery was very highly fired. So they had even better kilns in southern Mesopotamia than they had before. The pottery is usually kind of a dark brown or blackish paint on kind of a buff color or a pale green color. Usually these kind of geometric patterns. It's all still handmade, although they are beginning to develop the wheel at this point. I think by the next period is when you really have the first wheel. And the potter's wheel, was a very important development, as we'll talk about. You can see the different kinds of Ubaid pottery. You also find these nails, quote unquote. They look like nails. We don't know exactly what they are. Maybe they're, some people call them mullers. One idea is that they're sort of pestles that would be used to grind up things, but no one is exactly sure what these objects were. But they're very typical of Ubaid culture. You also have these cone-headed figurines, male and female, with these kind of coffee bean-shaped eyes. Looks like reptilian features. Right? So here's a female figurine here. Here's a male figurine. Some of the male figurines are holding maces. Maybe these maces are symbols of power. That's one interpretation. They kind of have these decorations on their body. This is kind of my personal favorite interpretation, as you can see. And they also had clay sickles. These kind of boomerang-shaped things are sickles to harvest their mainly barley in southern Mesopotamia, because barley is a more salt and heat-resistant crop, to harvest their barley. Now, why didn't they use flints like we saw in Natufian sites and PPNB sites? Because they didn't have that resource. They didn't have flint to make sickles. So in some ways, as we said, they were so resource poor that the only way they could harvest their grain was by making sickles out of clay. All right, Ubaid architecture, again, is this T-shaped house or T-shaped building with sort of a central room that we saw earlier in Samarran culture. As we're going to see, this becomes kind of the standard shape for houses, but it also becomes kind of there's a sort of an adoption of this shape, as we'll see, with temples. And so the organization of space becomes kind of a important dynamic, and also sort of shows a sort of worldview in a sense, how they viewed their world. Architecture, says a lot about a culture, how space is used, how it's divided up, where certain activities occur. And it's during this Ubaid time that we see the first appearance in Mesopotamia of ritual public architecture. And what we're talking about are temples. Right? This is just another anthropological way of saying temples. But these are not shrines. Shrines exist in domestic units in people's houses. These are separate buildings that are above an individual household that have special architecture that you can identify them as temples. And there also seems to be the existence of an institution, right? So it's not just temples that are appearing. It's probably also the priesthood and the institution of the temple that is also emerging. So it's different from Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe, you have communal ritual structures as well. But here it's a little bit different. Okay, so one of the most important sites in understanding the Ubaid period is Eridu. You can kind of see the extent of the Persian Gulf at that point. This is where it is today. But you had lots of marshes and the extent of the Persian Gulf up here. Kind of, a mixture of fresh water. Now, Eridu is one of the best-known sites in terms of the Ubaid. It's a tell site in southern Mesopotamia. You can see that it's very dry today. Now, according to Mesopotamian mythology, it's interesting because according to Mesopotamian mythology, Eridu is where really everything began in terms of civilization. According to the Babylonian epic, a reed had not come forth, a tree had not been created, a house had not been made, a city had not been made, all the lands were sea, then Eridu was made. Right? So Eridu is an important site archaeologically. It's also an important site in terms of the mythology of the people in Mesopotamia. Okay, now Fuad Safar, Iraqi archaeologists, excavated at Eridu, and they start to excavate on this, what they knew were temples at the end of the Ubaid period. Right? That is, they start to excavate what they knew was a temple. The architecture of temples in Mesopotamia was very well known, and this kind of architecture extends into the later periods. So they knew it was a temple, and they excavated it down to its lowest levels. And then they started to continue in the area right next to the temple and continue down. In archaeology, especially in the Middle East, like tell sites, once you document something, in order to see what's beneath it, you have to either remove it or dig down next to it. And so they started to dig down, and what they found was an earlier temple in the same spot, smaller, but the same basic architecture. They continued to dig down further, and what they found was another temple, older in time, smaller, but the same architecture. And they continued again further down, and they found yet another temple, smaller, older, same basic architecture. And again, digging even further down, same basic structure, but smaller, until they got to the beginning of the Ubaid period, where they found a very small temple in the spot where all those later temples appear. And you can see the archaeologists for scale here. This is a very small temple, yet the architecture is the same. Mesopotamian temples will have an offering table in them. They'll have these kind of little niches, and they'll also have some sort of pedestal where probably the image of the god was placed. Now, it's almost like those little wooden Russian nesting dolls where you open up one and there's a smaller one inside. You open up the next one, there's an even smaller one inside, and so on until you get to a very tiny one. And so this tells us a lot about what was going on in the Ubaid period. Again, this is the first time we see this in Mesopotamia. And apart from Göbekli Tepe, this is the first time we really see this in the Neolithic. Okay, the temples are based around that T-shaped structure, as we'll see. And typically temples, again, would have an offering table in the largest part near the altar where the image of the god was placed. Now, it's fitting that it's based off of the T-shaped houses because we know in the ancient Middle East, temples were considered to be the houses of the gods. Even in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, Solomon's temple is described as being a house for God to dwell, right? Even before that, they have that tent, the tabernacle, that they carry in the wilderness, with Moses and the Israelites, where God essentially is supposed to dwell. Very similar to all the other kinds of temples that existed in the Middle East at that time. Okay, so now what does this tell us? The fact that, one, the temples get larger in size over time. Two, they're all the same basic layout. And three, they all happen to be in the same spot. Now, what do you think that indicates? Let's take the first part of it. The temples get larger and larger and larger over time. Well, many students say, when I ask them, what does this mean? Many students will say, well, the society may have been getting bigger. And that is true. The population was getting bigger. But more than that, building a large temple requires a large labor force. Calling up a large labor force requires leadership. Right? So whenever you see a monumental structure, you sort of have to think in your mind that the key ingredients to any monumental structure is, one, a labor force, and two, organization. Because you have to call people up, you have to feed them, you have to pay them. That requires organization. And so what we have here is with a temple, with a church, with a synagogue, with a mosque, you don't just have a building, but you have an institution. You have people to take care of it, to conduct the ceremonies, and within that institution, you typically have hierarchy. So in these ancient temples, you would have high priests, you'd have lower priests, you'd have scribes, priestesses, craftspeople. So it was not just a religious structure, it was also kind of an economic structure, like a lot of religious institutions today. So it's not just the building's getting bigger, it's the institution that's becoming more powerful, probably, right? I mean, that seems to be a good hypothesis or a good conclusion based on the evidence, that the temple as an institution is becoming more powerful through time. They can call up larger and larger labor force to build even larger and larger temples, right? So around 5000 BC, we have the smallest temple, and about 1,000 years later, we get this very, very large temple. Now, the fact that you have this unbroken chain of temples of the same size and not size, but the same basic shape and layout, shows this great cultural continuity. You don't have, let's say, the destruction of a temple, evidence of burning, and then a completely foreign architecture coming in and replacing it. That would not show cultural continuity. That would show some sort of replacement, maybe different people coming in. That's not what you have. You have an unbroken chain from the Ubaid period, from about 5000 BC, all the way up to the end of the Ubaid period, then into the next period, into the Sumerian civilization. Right? So these are really the Proto-Sumerians. This is what becomes the Sumerian civilization. So you have great cultural continuity here as well. So, all in all, what we see is that these temples show us that the institution of the temple is growing more powerful. There's a lot of cultural continuity. The size of the society is probably getting larger as well. And so associated with the temples, there probably are some sort of leaders. Now, who are these leaders? Are these priests? Are these chiefs? We're not exactly sure. But we could kind of imagine, right here, sort of a reimagining of one of those cone-headed figures, where those dots are these kind of shell decorations on him, carrying a mace. You could kind of, based on what we know later about temples, you could kind of imagine that there would have been storage inside the temples and important ceremonies conducted. We're going to learn more about Mesopotamian religion as the semester goes on. So this is what Eridu might have looked like. So there would have had reed houses, you would have had mud brick houses, you would have had people using the marsh areas, and producing crops, growing barley, etc., raising animals, and then you would have had a large temple. They think that the population of Eridu, was 1,000, then got into the low thousands. This was a large town. It wasn't quite what we would call a city yet. That will come later, as we'll see. Okay, and you also remember that because Mesopotamia is so flat, these ancient temples would have kind of dominated the landscape. You would have seen them everywhere. All right, so the temples are important. It tells us about the religious beliefs. It tells us that there is an institution that is above individual households. It's a public structure. And again, even in Sumerian mythology, it says, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Right? So Eridu is looked back on by the later Sumerians as kind of the beginning of things. All right, what do we know about the social structure of people in Eridu and the Ubaid culture in general? Well, we know that there were cemeteries, and in those cemeteries there were rich grave goods, kind of like what we saw with Samara culture, but even more so, showing that there is social stratification. Some people have more, some people have less. You probably have hierarchy within the society. Now, what were these temples and why were they important? But that is, what was their function beyond just worshiping the gods? We're going to get into that. There's some debate about that. Some people think that they were kind of like food storage areas, almost like banks for hard times that might occur because of a bad harvest. Okay, so how would you classify Ubaid culture? It doesn't seem to be a civilization yet, a state society. That comes later. It's obviously larger than a big man society or big woman society. Is it a chiefdom? That's probably a good analysis. It seems to have many of the important aspects of a chiefdom. Monumental architecture, the existence of hierarchy, the existence of an institution outside of the household, a fairly large population, larger than what you would see in a tribe or a big man or big woman society. And you also see differences, settlement hierarchy. So not every site is the same size. Eridu is a bigger site than many other Ubaid sites. So you have kind of large villages and smaller villages. Some of the largest Ubaid sites, like Eridu, would be something in the something around the size of 5 hectares. We're going to be talking about site size when we talk about the Uruk period, but a hectare is 2 football fields. So imagine 10 football fields adjoining each other. That's a good sized town. Not a city yet, but it's a good sized town. Okay, other sites in the Ubaid time period. Give us another sort of insight into Ubaid culture. So a site in southern Iraq called Tel Mador, because this house was burned, burning leads to good preservation. Lots of artifacts found on the floor, like pottery and stone tools and things like that. And the archaeologist was careful to sort of note where different things were located. And what they could see is that different activities took place in different rooms. And so the way that they organized space and the way they thought of the world almost was sort of a microcosm, or the house was sort of a microcosm of their worldview in some ways, right? So they had food processing areas and production and weaving areas, maybe a place taking care of infants. The main area was where the hearth was, and in the temple would be where the altar was. And this was an area probably for hospitality, exchange, and ritual, right? This is where you'd greet people, where you'd have, where you'd eat, maybe even have feasts. You had a storage area, and then you had an area where you kind of kept track of different things, maybe how much grain you currently had, that sort of thing. Right? So the tripartite building, it becomes a framework for domestic life, but also it's sort of a metaphor of the household extended to administration, ritual areas, because the temple has the same kind of setup. Right? Okay, you could tell a lot about a society by looking at architecture, how they organize themselves. Are genders segregated? Is there more flow between the houses? That sort of thing, right? You can look at the way houses are set up today versus the way houses were set up in the late 1800s. So today people tend to want sort of an open concept, quote unquote, design where there's more flow between rooms and less segregation between spaces and lots of spillover. And earlier, people liked strong demarcation between different roles, different uses. With richer families, where servants were versus the household, that kind of thing. So you can tell a lot about worldview based on architecture. Okay. In other parts of the Ubaid world, you find large structures as well. This is a site in Iran called Susa. You begin to see a large platform there. In Iraq, at Tel Ueli, you find what looks like a storage facility. These small, again, little cell-like structures. It looks like a centralized storage facility. It doesn't look like it was for the entire community. That is, it didn't hold enough grain to feed everybody, but it might have been for one large family. At another site, Tel Abada, what you can see here with these houses, right? You look at the houses. Do they all look the same size, or is there any house that seems to stand out? If you look, you can sort of see that this house is larger than the others. And in fact, what they found with this house, which they just called Building A, again, archaeologists are not that creative when it comes to naming things, as you'll see. This house looked like it was wealthier than many of the other houses at the site. It also had burials associated with it, where there were stone artifacts that were not found anywhere else. They also found these seals as well, made out of stone. So this stone was imported. It didn't exist in this area, and they're using it to create seals. As we're going to see, seals are important because they imply that you're sealing something to prevent someone from tampering with something. You also have the beginnings of these kinds of tokens, as we're going to see later on. These become very important. But these are probably used to keep track of amounts of different things. And one of the indicators, not just from the pottery itself, but also from the mistakes that they made in the kiln, show us that they had reached high temperatures in the kiln. This is what's known as a kiln waster. These are remnants of pottery that got messed up in the kiln and were never used. And what you have here is stacked pottery that actually fused and melted together because the temperatures in the kiln were so high, right? So it shows kind of a technological advancement during the Ubaid period. Right? Okay, so all put together, you got storage facilities, you have ritual public architecture, which shows the calling up of labor and also leadership. You have some houses that are bigger than others. You have differences in wealth and prestige goods. These are all good indications that what you have here is a chiefdom level society, in addition to the site hierarchy that we talked about. Right? Okay, one of the next things that we're going to look at, and this is one of the things that you're going to be examining with the discussion board, is the spread of Ubaid material culture out of southern Mesopotamia to areas to the north, and then also into the Persian Gulf. And we're going to briefly just talk a little bit about a site called Tepe Gawra, and that's a site that's going to be brought up in the reading, and sort of an interpretation of this movement of material culture north. All right, Tepe Gawra is a site in northern Iraq that was a halaf site, which then whose material culture then slowly shifted over to Ubaid material culture. And you're going to be reading and discussing what this actually means, what the evidence seems to suggest. But you can see Tepe Gawra right here. So this is the rain-fed area. This is very different from southern Mesopotamia. But over time, what you see during the Halaf period, here you can see the mound, the tell of Tepe Gawra. Tepe is just the Persian word for tell. This is in kind of the Kurdish region of Iraq. So there's kind of a mixture of different cultures here in more recent times. But here you can see, you should recognize what this is. This is the tholos, right? So here is a tholos. You can see with these subdivided sections here at Tepe Gawra in the early period, the Halaf period. Later on, what you see is a shift over to very distinct Ubaid material culture. You find tripartite houses. Again, that's something that we see from southern Mesopotamia. You also see Ubaid-style temples. You had 3 temples, same layout as the temple. One of them has the same layout as the temple in Eridu. That's what you can see here. So here's one of the Ubaid temples in Eridu. Here is the Ubaid temple in Tepe Gawra. It's, pretty much the same. Even some people say the sizes of the bricks are the same. This temple was about 40 feet this way and about 28 feet that way. What they found inside the temples were pottery and seals that show that these were obviously important structures. All these temples were not probably in use all at the same time. At least it looks like they weren't built at the same time, and some probably went out of use while others were used. Here you can see the excavation of one of these temples. And this is maybe what it looked like during its height. So we could sort of imagine lots of different activities that would have taken place there in the public area in front of these temples. So we find ceilings that were with a continuity in terms of designs from the Halaf period. You can see here's a stone seal and the clay impression. Here's another stone seal and the impression. You can see a lot of them show wild animals. One particularly interesting one shows people, you can see here outside this vat with long straws, and this is from the end of the Ubaid period here, and what they are doing is most likely drinking beer from a jar. We know later on in Mesopotamia that drinking beer a lot of times was sort of a public thing. They would use straws to drink beer because the beer was unfiltered and the yeast and other things would float to the surface, and they would use the straws to get below that, to get at the good stuff underneath. And that's most likely what is being depicted here. Okay, another important structure besides those temples that dates to kind of the late Ubaid period is the roundhouse. Again, creative name for what they found. But this was a distinctive structure because most of the domestic structures were, square, rectangular. This one was clearly different. It was round, and there were also different rooms laid out. Now, this is the material that was excavated at this lower level. Because of the thickness of the walls and because of artifacts that they found inside of these rooms that were in layers, right? That is, it looks like there was sort of a lower layer and then sort of roof material and then material probably from the second story and maybe even the third story. These are sort of reconstruction based on what they think might have been there. But this lower level is, without a doubt, they can reconstruct from the archaeology. Now, what they found inside of this round building were trade goods that were not locally available. One of them we're going to talk more about throughout the semester, And it is a blue stone called lapis lazuli. You probably have heard about lapis lazuli. It's a beautiful blue color. We're going to see it throughout Mesopotamia. And it's only found in one place in the world, and that's Afghanistan, which is hundreds of miles away. Really thousands of miles. So it had to come a very long distance through trade routes to get to northern Mesopotamia. So that shows that these people, some of the people, were tapped into these long distance trading networks. And we find these trading networks, and we find the trade goods really concentrated in households like this roundhouse. Now, in the roundhouse, they found lots of these clay ceilings, pieces of clay that were impressed by those seals. And some of the seals have impressions of ropes on the other side from where the seal is. And so it looks like these clay seals were used to seal jars and doors and sacks and boxes and all sorts of things. They were stamped to prevent people from opening things up and messing with their contents. Now, this is not going to prevent someone from doing that, but it will make it visible if someone does, right? So it's what we call, it's not tamper-proof, but it's tamper-evident. We're going to talk more about seals and why they're important, but it's a form of control. People are trying to prevent other people from going inside of these doors, going inside of these boxes. So it shows some sort of control by a central figure, maybe, some sort of authority controlling some of these wealth items in the roundhouse. All right, we'll talk more about this next week. We'll finish up with the Ubaid next week, and then we'll get into the next period, which is the Uruk period. Okay, I hope you have a good rest of your week, and please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, or you just want to talk to me. I'm happy to talk at any time.